What if the comedy that defined a generation wasn't born in laughter, but in betrayal? You ever sit back and think about the people we call legends? The ones we trust with our nostalgia, our memories, our tears and belly laughs. The ones whose work has shaped pop culture so deeply, it feels like they've lived in our living rooms for decades. Now, imagine one of those legends built their empire on a lie. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. This isn't just another Hollywood feud. This is the story of how a seemingly innocent collaboration between two comedic giants, Mel Brooks and Rob Reiner, spiraled into one of the darkest, most devastating stories to ever come out of the industry. A story involving stolen genius, shattered friendship, and eventually, bloodshed. And the man who finally broke the silence? None other than Mel Brooks himself. This tale doesn't begin with murder. It begins with genius, and ends with horror. But before we go there, before we examine crime scene photos, psychiatric reports, or hidden journals tucked under a murderer's bed, we need to go back. Back to the early 1980s. Back to a beach house in Malibu, where two men laughed, dreamed, and according to one of them, made history. Because Mel Brooks claims he birthed an idea in that house. An idea so brilliant, so biting, so ahead of its time, that it could have shifted the comedic landscape forever. And he shared it with Rob. But here's the thing, that idea never saw the light of day. At least, not with Mel's name on it. Decades later, it showed up again, this time, in a blockbuster comedy that made Rob Reiner a household name. Critics hailed it as genius. Studios showered him with awards. Audiences laughed, quoted, and rewatched it for years. But Mel Brooks? He watched in silence. Heartbroken, betrayed, and for 40 years, he said nothing. Why? Because speaking up meant war. Because when the person who steals from you is someone you once loved like a son, the pain cuts differently. Because the industry doesn't reward the whistleblower, it rewards the success story. But all that changed the night Rob Reiner and his wife Michelle were found brutally murdered in their $13.5 million Brentwood estate. Their son, Nick Reiner, just 32 years old, was arrested on the scene. And the moment that news hit the airwaves, the phone calls began. Writers, directors, producers, assistants from decades past, people who knew something wasn't right, people who had buried whispers, suspicions, and memories, people who remembered Mel. Because behind that arrest, behind the blood-soaked headlines, there was another story unraveling. A story about ambition, about erasure, about what happens when one man takes credit for another's soul and gets away with it for decades. Until everything finally explodes. This video isn't just about a crime. It's about the consequences of betrayal. It's about the pressure cooker that Hollywood becomes when egos are unchecked and legacies are up for grabs. But before we dive into journals filled with rage, before we replay the haunting 911 call made by Rob's daughter Romy, before we reveal exactly what Mel Brooks finally said after 4 decades of silence, you need to understand just how deep this wound goes. Because make no mistake, this wasn't just professional theft. This was personal. This was family. This was war. Let's talk about the friendship that started it all. Mel and Rob weren't strangers. They were more than collaborators. They shared dinners, families, dreams. Mel mentored Rob in the early days. He opened doors, gave feedback, pushed Rob to go bold. And Rob listened, at first. But somewhere along the way, admiration turned to imitation. And imitation turned to theft. There's a reason Mel Brooks didn't sue. A reason he didn't go public. A reason he kept smiling through gritted teeth every time someone praised the brilliance of Reiner's early films. Because to Mel, those weren't Rob's films. Not entirely. And the world had no idea. Until now. So, why does this story matter today? Because in a world obsessed with intellectual property and content empires, this is a cautionary tale. It's a reminder that sometimes, behind the most celebrated names are silenced voices and erased fingerprints. It's also a human story. A story about love turned sour, about trust betrayed, and about how silence can sometimes be deadlier than rage. And here's the twist. While Mel remained quiet for 40 years, someone else wasn't. Nick Reiner. A man raised in the shadow of a legend. A man who knew things no one else did. Who resented not just his father's fame, but the way that fame was built. Sources claim Nick knew about the idea, knew about the betrayal, knew his father had taken something that didn't belong to him. And in his journal, later found by LAPD in a drawer in the guest house, he wrote one chilling line. He stole from a genius. He lied to the world, and no one made him pay. That line sent shockwaves through the LAPD's investigation. But it sent something worse through Mel Brooks, because it confirmed his worst fear, that the thing he stayed silent about had been passed down like a curse. Now, you might be wondering, if Mel knew all this, why speak now? Why break 4 decades of silence after Rob is already dead? Simple. Because Mel wants the truth out before he's gone too. At 100 years old, the legendary filmmaker has seen it all. Fame, fortune, heartbreak, loss. But he hadn't seen justice. Until now. In a private letter sent to the Academy, Mel reportedly poured out his soul. He detailed the stolen concept, the years of silence, the pain of watching someone else claim his glory. He didn't demand awards, money, or headlines. He just wanted the truth documented, so that history wouldn't forget what really happened. And in that letter, he dropped a bombshell, the name of the film Rob allegedly stole from him. And trust me, when we tell you which film it was, your jaw will hit the floor. Because it's not some obscure cult hit. It's a movie you know. A movie you probably love. A movie that may never feel the same after this video. But that reveal comes later. For now, understand this. Mel Brooks isn't just another bitter artist airing grievances. He's a man confronting the final chapter of his life. A man trying to reclaim his voice after being silenced. A man watching his former protege die in a scandal so grotesque, it's become a national obsession. And the most shocking part? Mel never wanted it to end this way. He didn't want blood. He wanted acknowledgement. But when truth is buried long enough, it doesn't die. It erupts. And in the Reiner household, it erupted with a vengeance. Over the next hour, we'll walk you through every twist, every journal entry, every whispered conversation between Mel and the people who knew. We'll show you the tape that allegedly captures Rob joking about stealing gold from a genius. We'll introduce you to the woman who disappeared from the industry after threatening to go public with what she knew. And we'll reveal the one moment, decades ago, that sealed Mel's silence and doomed a family. But before we dig into the bloodstains, before we dissect courtroom transcripts and secret letters to the Academy, let's start where all good stories begin, with the idea, the one that changed everything. Because what came next, no one saw coming. What's the cost of a single idea? Not just any idea, but the kind that could electrify the screen, reinvent comedy, and shift the pulse of a generation. What happens when that idea, your idea, is taken, dressed in someone else's name, and paraded before the world as if you never existed? Mel Brooks knows, but he didn't always. Because at first, it wasn't about theft. It was about magic. Picture it, 1982. The Malibu coastline, waves crashing against the rocks like a drumbeat of destiny. A beach house rented by Mel Brooks himself. Sunlight pouring through massive windows, pages of yellow-lined paper littering the coffee table, bowls of mixed nuts barely touched. And in the center of it all, 2 men hunched over notepads, laughing, bickering, dreaming. Mel and Rob. It was a collaboration that Hollywood insiders whispered about with reverence. The comedy king and the rising prince. The mentor and the mentee. Mel was already a legend by then. Blazing Saddles, Young Frankenstein, the producers, all game changers. But Mel wasn't done. He had more stories to tell. And he loved grooming talent. He saw Rob as fresh, smart, and eager. He also saw something else in him. Hunger. Not the bad kind. Not yet. Just ambition. Raw and bubbling. That spark in the eye of someone who doesn't want to imitate greatness. They want to build their own throne. And Mel, generous to a fault, welcomed him in. That weekend in Malibu wasn't just a casual hangout. It was a writing retreat. They were batting around story ideas for a film that was supposed to feel unlike anything before it. An absurdist mockumentary with satirical teeth, dissecting fame, failure, and the lies we tell to be remembered. And then, the concept came. Mel had been playing with a premise for months. He called it The Hollow Man. A comedic tragedy about a washed-up filmmaker who fakes his own death to become famous, only to realize too late that the world only values you once you're gone. A biting satire. Hilarious. Heartbreaking. and just dark enough to scare off most studios. But Rob? He loved it. He called it revolutionary, said it reminded him of Orson Welles crossed with Monty Python, that it would be a career-defining moment for whoever brought it to life. And Mel, beaming with pride, told Rob everything. The structure, the twist ending, even a few punchlines that hadn't made it into any scripts yet. They stayed up until 3 a.m. sketching out scenes. But by Monday morning, something had changed. Rob left in a hurry. No goodbye, no thank you. Just a muttered, "I've got meetings back in the city." Mel didn't think much of it. Hollywood people vanish all the time. But the retreat ended. The idea was shelved, and life moved on. Or so he thought. 2 years later, Mel was in a screening room. He had been invited to a test screening of a new film from Reiner, his big directorial debut. This is Spinal Tap. And within the first 10 minutes, Mel's stomach sank. Not because it was bad, because it was too good, because it felt too familiar. Not in plot. Spinal Tap wasn't about a dead filmmaker. It was a faux documentary about a rock band. But it was the tone, the style, the mock interviews, the way it bent reality just enough to make you question what was real and what was scripted. Mel had never seen anything like it, except for the thing they had dreamed up together. Now let's pause here. This is where some might say, well, ideas evolve. Concepts change. Maybe Rob was inspired, but didn't steal. Fair question. But here's where things get twisted. In an interview just a few months after the release of Spinal Tap, Rob Reiner was asked where the idea came from. He smiled, leaned back, and said, "I just thought, what if we followed a band around like a documentary crew? I've never seen anything like that before." Mel nearly choked when he read that, because he had seen it before, in his own handwriting. In that Malibu beach house, on yellow-lined paper now nowhere to be found. And still, he said nothing. Why? Because Spinal Tap was a hit. It was the kind of weird, bold project that could have flopped, but didn't. It launched Rob into directorial stardom. And Mel? He wasn't about to be the bitter old man crying plagiarism. Not when the movie didn't technically steal his plot, just his blueprint. Besides, there was no proof. The notes were gone, the conversations unwitnessed. It would be his word against the darling of a new Hollywood. So Mel did what he had done his entire life. He turned pain into performance. He clapped. He smiled. He praised the film in public. And in private, he buried the hollow man deep in a drawer. He didn't write again for nearly 2 years. But the seed of doubt, of betrayal, had already taken root. It festered quietly, until the day another assistant accidentally played Mel a behind-the-scenes interview clip. One where Rob, now cocky and emboldened, laughed with cast members about how the movie's concept just came to him on a weekend at the beach. That beach. That weekend. The one with Mel. And that was when Mel knew. This wasn't a coincidence. This wasn't subconscious inspiration. This was theft. And it wasn't just the idea. It was the trust. The bond. The mentorship Mel had offered with an open heart. All of it. Used and discarded. But instead of fighting back, Mel locked it all away. For 40 years, he went on to make Spaceballs, Robin Hood, Men in Tights, Dracula, Dead, and loving it. But something had shifted. The comedy felt louder, broader, a little less intimate. Because deep down, Mel felt like part of his soul had been ripped away and passed off as someone else's masterpiece. Now fast forward to today. Rob Reiner is found murdered in his Brentwood mansion, his wife beside him, his son arrested in the guest house. And Mel? Mel's sitting at home, 100 years old, watching the news in silence. Until someone calls him. A journalist. One who had heard whispers over the years. About a stolen concept. About a beach house. About a betrayal too painful to print. And Mel, for the first time in 4 decades, says 3 words. He stole it. That moment cracked open a vault of secrets that had been sealed shut for generations. Mel's friends began to talk. Assistants came forward. A few old, dusty notebooks were dug out of storage. And what they found matched word for word with the Spinal Tap concept Rob had claimed credit for. Not the plot, but the DNA, the documentary format, the satire of fame, the tragicomic tone, the ending that left audiences unsure whether to laugh or cry. All of it, drawn from the hollow man. The industry was stunned, because if this was true, if Rob Reiner had stolen that seed, then watered it until it bloomed into the cult classic that launched his career. Then his entire reputation would be tainted. And worse, he had taken it from Mel Brooks, a man who gave him everything. But this isn't just about two filmmakers. It's about what happens when trust dies, when ambition blinds, when a lie is told so often, it becomes history. Mel's silence didn't just cost him recognition. It cost him closure. And Rob? He died before ever owning up to it. Unless someone else knew. Someone who grew up hearing whispers in that house. Someone who saw the cracks. Someone who read a journal, watched a documentary, and realized his father's genius might not have been his own. Someone like Nick Reiner. Because when detectives searched that guest house, they found more than blood. They found stories. They found rage. They found a name written over and over again. Mel. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. What if your success was built on a secret, and you knew it every time someone shook your hand? Rob Reiner's ascent wasn't just a career, it was a coronation. By the early 1980s, Rob had successfully crossed the chasm so many actors fall into and never return from. He'd gone from beloved TV star, meathead from All in the Family, to a rising Hollywood power player. But unlike other sons of famous fathers or actors who tried to reinvent themselves behind the camera, Rob had something more. He had timing, he had charm, and he had a film that would change everything. This is Spinal Tap. But let's pause for a second. To most, Spinal Tap was a joke that kept getting better the more you watched. A goofy, mock documentary about a fictional British rock band so tragically out of touch, they wrapped themselves in leather and confusion while their amps exploded on stage. It was subtle, sharp, satirical, and it was new. Or so it seemed. Audiences and critics lost their minds. The film bombed at first but clawed its way into the culture. Roger Ebert called it a satirical masterpiece. College students quoted it line for line. Bands referenced it like scripture. And Rob? He became a legend. Suddenly, he was no longer just Carl Reiner's son. He was a force of his own. The comedic genius with the Midas touch. The man who made something out of nothing. That's what they called him. But those who were in that Malibu house knew better. Still, the town cheered him on. And Reiner, to his credit, kept the hits coming. After Spinal Tap, he released The Sure Thing, a romantic comedy that proved he wasn't a one-hit wonder. Then came Stand By Me, a coming-of-age story adapted from Stephen King that solidified him as not just a comedic mind, but a storyteller of deep emotional range. He could make you laugh and make you cry. Then came The Princess Bride, and suddenly, Rob Reiner was untouchable. Every interview, every article, every Hollywood dinner. They all painted him as the golden boy, the filmmaker who saw things no one else could, the man who took risks and turned them into timeless magic. But here's the twist. As Rob rose, Mel disappeared. Not literally, of course. Mel was still working, still writing. But that edge, that fierce originality, that signature satire that could slice through cultural nonsense like a razor, it started to fade. Why? Because a part of him had been taken. Quietly, publicly, without credit. And now, that theft was shaping the industry. Think about it. How many young filmmakers were inspired by Spinal Tap? How many careers were launched because Rob Reiner dared to play with the mockumentary format? How many awards were given, not just to Rob, but to the idea he didn't create? Now let's rewind a bit. Because while the public was falling in love with the image of Rob, the charming, funny, sharp-witted director behind classics, there were people behind the curtain watching something else. And some were taking notes. There were rumors. Always had been. Little whispers at cocktail parties. Comments overheard on studio lots. Didn't Mel have something like that? Rob didn't write that script alone, right? I swear I saw that format in one of Brooks' old notebooks. But in Hollywood, whispers are currency. And if you don't have proof, you don't speak. Rob's genius narrative kept spinning. By the early 1990s, he had become more than a director. He was a voice, an activist, a liberal heavyweight in an increasingly conservative town. He spoke truth to power. He rallied for causes. He publicly opposed wars. He made documentaries. To the world, Rob was the guy who stood for justice. But privately, there was a story he never touched. He never mentioned Mel Brooks in his interviews. Never credited him as an early influence. Never once brought up that weekend in Malibu. He acted like it never happened, even as Mel's friends quietly pulled away. Even as one former assistant confirmed, she had typed an outline called The Hollow Man in 1983. Even as industry insiders started asking, why hasn't Mel done another original concept since? And then came the darkest twist of all. Nick, Rob's son, born into this glittering empire, raised among legends, surrounded by brilliance, and burdened by a shadow. Nick was always troubled. He battled addiction from a young age, spent time in rehabs, dropped out of projects, lived in the guest house behind his parents' mansion for years. To outsiders, he was a failure, a sad Hollywood cautionary tale. But to those who knew him, he was haunted, because Nick had read the old scripts. He'd seen the notes. He knew what his father had done, and it ate at him. Over the years, he made quiet comments to friends. Once, at a party, he reportedly told a former producer, "You think my dad's a genius? He's a thief. Ask Mel." The producer laughed it off. But Nick wasn't joking, because the empire his father built was balanced on a lie. And every time someone praised Rob's legacy, Nick saw a crime scene. And that resentment, that twisted brew of envy, betrayal, and guilt, it was building. Fast forward to 2025. Rob Reiner is now 78. Slower, more introspective, still respected, still hailed as a legend. Mel Brooks is nearing 100. Still sharp, still smiling. But there's a tremble in his voice when he talks about trust. And Nick? Nick's disappearing from the spotlight entirely. Until January 3rd, 2026, when the LAPD receives a 911 call from a frantic young woman, Rob Reiner. She's crying, screaming, "I found them. Both of them. There's so much blood. Please hurry. He's still here. He's in the guest house. He's in the guest house." By the time police arrive at the Brentwood estate, Rob and Michelle are gone. Stab wounds. Brutal. Personal. And Nick? Nick is calm. Sitting on a couch in the guest house, hands stained red, flipping through an old leather-bound journal. When officers ask what happened, Nick looks up and says one word. "Mel." The arrest is immediate. The charges, double homicide. The motive? At first, unclear. But within days, investigators find the journal. Page after page of angry rants. Scribbles about lies, about legacies, about theft. One sentence, underlined in red. "He stole the voice of the man who raised him. And I watched the world call it genius." Another page. "The Hollow Man was never his. He was the Hollow Man." The press explodes. TMZ, CNN, Variety. Director Rob Reiner murdered by son. Hollywood in shock. Brooks breaks silence on decades-old betrayal. And Mel? He gives a single, devastating quote to The Hollywood Reporter. "I tried to forgive, but silence is its own kind of violence." The world gasps. Because now, the myth is broken. The golden boy has blood on his name. The genius director's first hit may not have been his. And Mel Brooks? He's no longer laughing. But what's more shocking is what comes next. Because as the investigation deepens, police uncover another name in the journal. A name tied to that Malibu weekend. A name no one had mentioned in decades. Someone who might have witnessed the moment Rob crossed the line. Someone who had disappeared right after Spinal Tap's success. And that someone is about to resurface. But what she knows could rewrite Hollywood history. How do you prove a crime that happened before anyone called it a crime? That's the question Mel Brooks faced. That's the agony that clawed at him for 40 years. Because when the person who stole from you wears your old smile, tells your best jokes, and walks red carpets with your forgotten brilliance, there's no siren to call, no police report to file, no studio willing to listen, only silence. And somewhere in that silence, the truth gets buried. But not forever, because even buried things can come back up, especially when someone starts digging. And in this case, the digging began where so many of Hollywood's secrets hide, in boxes, cardboard time capsules tucked away in basements, back closets, storage units no one has touched since cocaine-fueled premieres and neon-colored scripts were the norm. Let's rewind. After the arrest of Nick Reiner and the shocking murder of Rob and Michelle, Hollywood went into a tailspin. Reporters scrambled, reputations reeled. Fans reevaluated everything they ever loved about Reiner's filmography. But behind the scenes, something even bigger was happening. Mel Brooks had started talking. Not shouting, not accusing, just telling. And when Mel speaks, the world listens. He mentioned a title, The Hollow Man. He mentioned a weekend in Malibu. He mentioned an assistant, one who helped type early drafts. A woman who vanished from the industry shortly after Spinal Tap's release. Her name? Deborah Kane. If that name doesn't ring a bell, you're not alone. She wasn't famous. Not on IMDb. No red carpet photos. Just a ghost in old studio payrolls. A name scribbled in memos. An intern-turned assistant with a photographic memory and a habit of taking detailed notes. Mel described her as the one who remembered everything. The kind of assistant you trust with ideas not because she's quiet, but because she listens better than anyone else in the room. And according to Mel, Deborah had been present during that legendary Malibu weekend. She typed the notes. She transcribed the conversations. She even kept a backup copy of the outline for the Hollow Man. But after Spinal Tap exploded, Deborah left town. No goodbyes. No interviews. Just gone. Until now. Because when word spread that Mel had named her and detectives uncovered fragments of her name in Nick's journal, reporters went hunting. And one found her. Living under a different name in Tucson, Arizona. She'd become a high school English teacher. Married. Kids. Quiet life. But when approached by the Hollywood Chronicle and shown Mel's recent statements, Deborah didn't run. She paused. She closed her eyes. And then, quietly, she said, "I still have the pages." That revelation changed everything. A week later, she appeared at Mel's home in Beverly Hills. Not a media circus. No entourage. Just a woman holding a sealed manila envelope like it weighed 50 pounds. Inside, the original Hollow Man treatment, typed in 1982, with Mel Brooks' handwriting scribbled in the margins. And at the top of page 1, in faded Sharpie, RB plus MB, Malibu draft. RB, Rob Reiner. MB, Mel Brooks. There it was. Proof. Not hearsay. Not vague memory. But physical, date-stamped, annotated proof that Rob had collaborated with Mel on a concept nearly identical in tone, format, and spirit to what would later become This Is Spinal Tap. The document included a fictional documentary style following a delusional public figure, mock interviews with supporting characters who contradicted each other, deadpan satire highlighting the absurdity of fame, a third-act twist involving a fake funeral, and several jokes, specific jokes, that made their way, nearly word for word, into the final cut of Spinal Tap. But here's where it gets even darker. Attached to the packet was a handwritten note Deborah said she received from Rob in late 1983, months before Spinal Tap began shooting. It read, "Thanks for all your help during our brainstorm weekend. Sorry things got confusing after that. Let's keep this between us. Hope Tucson is treating you well." It was vague, but chilling. Especially when you realize Deborah had never told Rob she was moving to Tucson. He found out. He knew. And he still asked her to stay silent. And for 40 years, she did. Until now. When confronted with the documents, Mel reportedly wept. Not because of the betrayal. That pain had aged into something duller, something tolerable. But because someone remembered. Because someone kept the pages. Now think about that. In an industry built on flash drives, rewritten history, and NDAs, a single manila envelope becomes a time bomb. The press got wind of the envelope, of course. Headlines splashed. Spinal Tap origin scandal. Reiner legacy in jeopardy after discovery of missing treatment. Brooks had it first, documents show. And that's when the Academy got involved. Quietly, privately, a panel of archivists and historians requested to view the pages. Mel agreed, on one condition. The truth gets documented. Not awards, not lawsuits, just recognition. Because Mel wasn't chasing revenge. He was chasing peace. And then, something unexpected happened. A second copy of The Hollow Man surfaced. This time from a retired studio executive named Henry Daly, who had briefly worked at Embassy Pictures in the 80s. He'd apparently received a pitch from Mel and Rob before the idea was dropped. He too had kept a file. And that file contained a production memo dated 1982. A memo referencing a mockumentary-style comedy project under consideration, tagged with initials. R. Reiner/M. Brooks. Suddenly, 2 documents, 2 witnesses, 2 timelines. The lie, cracking. The legend, shaking. And in that chaos, another voice emerged. Romy Reiner, Rob's daughter. The one who found the bodies. The one who made the 911 call. She issued a statement through her attorney. "My father was a brilliant man, and I loved him. But we cannot heal if we deny the truth. I believe Mel Brooks. I believe Deborah Kane. And I believe my brother when he says the theft broke him. That admission was more powerful than any headline. It was an heir to a Hollywood dynasty acknowledging, publicly, that the roots of her family's legacy were poisoned. And it wasn't over yet, because investigators were about to uncover something even more damning. A recording. Not professional. Not studio quality. Just an old cassette tape. Found inside a shoebox in the Brentwood guest house. Labeled in black marker. Beach House, 82. On it. 3 voices. Mel, Rob, and Deborah. Laughing. Brainstorming. Building. And then a sentence from Rob. This is gonna be gold, man. It's like satire disguised as a documentary. If this works, people think it's real. It's genius. If we pull it off, I'll owe you my career. The tape cuts out shortly after that. But the damage is done. Because for the first time, we hear Rob Reiner call it Mel's idea. And then 40 years of silence. Until now. But as the world starts to see the cracks in Rob's genius, there's still one missing piece. One final person who hasn't spoken. The one who knew both men. Who heard the jokes, saw the drafts, watched the shift. The third collaborator. Because Mel and Rob weren't alone that weekend. There was someone else. Someone everyone forgot. Until Nick named her in his journal. And she is ready to talk. What does it take to make a legend finally speak? After 40 years of silence. Is it proof? Is it betrayal piled on betrayal? Or is it the moment when staying quiet becomes heavier than telling the truth? For Mel Brooks, it was all of it. And then something else entirely. Because when the missing pages resurfaced, when Deborah Kane walked back into his life holding a manila envelope like a confession, when the tape crackled to life and played a younger Rob Reiner's voice calling the idea gold, Mel felt something he hadn't felt in decades. Relief. Not victory. Not triumph. Relief. Relief that he wasn't crazy. Relief that his memory hadn't betrayed him. Relief that the pain he carried quietly, through premieres, standing ovations, and smiling interviews, had a shape now. A name. A paper trail. But relief quickly gave way to something heavier. Responsibility. Because when the truth finally knocks, you can't pretend you're not home. For years, Mel had told himself silence was noble. That it was generous. That it protected the work, the friendship, the industry he loved. He believed staying quiet spared everyone embarrassment, including Rob. But staring at those pages, hearing that tape, Mel realized something brutal. Silence hadn't protected anyone. It had protected the lie. And that lie had metastasized, through careers, through reputations, through a family that now lay shattered by violence. This is where Mel Brooks stops being a passive witness and becomes an active force. But make no mistake, this wasn't a press tour. This wasn't a revenge campaign. This was a reckoning. It began quietly. A letter. Handwritten. Addressed not to the media, not to a studio, not to a court, but to the Academy. The Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences. The gatekeepers of legacy. The archivists of history. Mel knew exactly what he was doing. Because if the truth wasn't documented there, it might as well not exist. In the letter, Mel didn't accuse. He didn't rage. He didn't dramatize. He simply told the story. The Malibu weekend. The brainstorm. The concept. The missing pages. The silence. He wrote about trust. About mentorship. About how collaboration requires honesty. And how betrayal corrodes more than just careers. It corrodes people. And then he wrote one sentence that made even hardened archivists pause. I stayed quiet because I loved him. I'm speaking now because the silence has already killed enough. That line alone sent shockwaves through Hollywood's quiet corridors. Because it reframed everything. This wasn't about plagiarism anymore. This was about consequences. Mel didn't name the film in that first letter. He didn't need to. The documentation spoke for itself. The initials, the drafts, the dates. But the Academy asked him for clarification. And that's when Mel said it out loud. For the first time. In a recorded, closed-door session, Mel Brooks identified this as Spinal Tap as the work that carried the DNA of the Hollow Man. Not stolen scene for scene. Not copied word for word. But lifted at the root. The form. The conceit. The satirical lens. The thing that made it revolutionary. And when that acknowledgement was transcribed, stamped, and archived, history shifted. Quietly, irrevocably. But the Academy wasn't the only place Mel spoke. Because once you break a silence that long, the dam doesn't just crack. It collapses. A reporter from The Hollywood Reporter, someone Mel had trusted for years, asked him a question no one had ever dared to ask before. Do you regret not speaking sooner? Mel paused, longer than the reporter expected. And then he said something that stunned everyone in the room. I regret thinking silence was kindness. That quote went viral within hours, because it resonated far beyond Mel and Rob. It resonated with every writer whose idea had been taken, every assistant told to keep quiet, every creator who watched someone else climb using their ladder. Suddenly, Mel wasn't just telling his story. He was unlocking everyone else's. And the stories came flooding in. Anonymous emails, phone calls in the middle of the night, producers admitting they'd heard things, writers confessing they'd signed away concepts under pressure. Hollywood had always run on secrets. But now, one of its most beloved voices was saying the quiet part out loud. And that terrified people. Because when legends speak, institutions tremble. Studios scrambled to issue carefully worded statements. Lawyers advised silence. Publicists worked overtime to contain narratives. But the truth had momentum now. And it wasn't just Mel speaking. Deborah Kane came forward publicly for the first time. Not with anger, not with accusations, but with clarity. She confirmed the Malibu weekend, confirmed the drafts, confirmed that she had been asked, politely, quietly, to disappear. She described the moment she realized Spinal Tap wasn't just inspired by the brainstorm. It felt like watching someone wear your clothes and pretend they'd always belonged to them. That line cut deep. And then came Rob Reiner's interview. The daughter who had discovered the bodies. The daughter who had grown up believing her father was untouchable. She spoke softly, carefully, but her words landed like thunder. My father was brilliant. But brilliance doesn't excuse everything, and pretending otherwise only destroys families. She didn't condemn him. She didn't defend him. She told the truth as she saw it. And that may have been the most painful moment of all. Because when even family acknowledges cracks in the foundation, denial becomes impossible. Mel watched that interview alone. He didn't smile. He didn't cry. He whispered something to himself. According to a close friend, he said, "She's braver than I was." That admission matters. Because Mel wasn't positioning himself as a hero. He was admitting failure. Failure to speak sooner. Failure to protect the truth. Failure to stop a lie from becoming legacy. But the question everyone wanted answered, the one buzzing beneath every headline, was this. Why now? Why speak after Rob's death? Why not confront him while he was alive? Mel answered that too. In an interview recorded but not aired until later, he said, I wanted him to tell the truth himself. I gave him decades to do it. Decades. Let that sink in. Mel didn't ambush Rob. He didn't trap him. He didn't expose him publicly. He waited. He waited for conscience. And when conscience never came, only success, accolades, and silence. Mel carried the weight alone, until that silence became unbearable, until murder forced the truth into daylight. And here's where the story takes a turn you might not expect. Because Mel didn't want Rob canceled. He didn't want films pulled. He didn't want history erased. He wanted acknowledgement. He wanted the record corrected. He wanted future generations to know collaboration can be sacred or destructive. And that silence isn't neutral. It chooses a side. As Mel's voice grew louder, pressure mounted on the institutions that had celebrated Rob Reiner for decades. Film schools quietly revised curricula. Archivists added footnotes. Panels debated ethical collaboration. And behind the scenes, prosecutors were watching too. Because as more evidence surfaced, journals, tapes, corroborating witnesses, the motive behind Nick Reiner's alleged actions took on a chilling clarity. This wasn't random violence. This wasn't a sudden snap. It was obsession. An inheritance of resentment passed down alongside fame. Nick's journal entries, already disturbing, began to read less like madness and more like a twisted moral crusade. He built a career on someone else's soul. They all clapped. No one made it right. Those words took on new meaning when placed beside Mel's silence. And that's the hardest truth of all. Mel didn't cause the violence. But the silence around the lie helped shape the environment it grew in. That realization haunted him. Friends say Mel asked one question repeatedly after everything broke. If I'd spoken sooner, would any of this have happened? There's no answer. But that question hangs over this entire story like a storm cloud. Because when lies live too long, they don't just distort history. They warp people. And now, as Mel Brooks finally breaks his silence. The truth is no longer just about who created what. It's about what happens when truth is delayed long enough to become dangerous. And as investigators dig deeper into Nick Reiner's past, into the third collaborator he mentioned by name, into the final confrontation inside that Brentwood mansion, one thing becomes terrifyingly clear. The silence didn't end the story. It only postponed the explosion. In the next chapter, it reveals how that silence planted the seeds for his son's rage. Because before the night of the murders, there were warnings. Ignored ones. And what comes next will make you wonder how many chances there were to stop this, before everything fell apart. What happens to the child who grows up in the shadow of stolen glory? Nick Reiner wasn't born into obscurity. He was born into the limelight, though not the center of it. From the moment of his birth in 1993, his last name was a spotlight he never asked for. He was the son of Rob Reiner, the Hollywood icon, grandson of Carl Reiner, the comedy pioneer, and by default, a living heir to a dynasty of genius. But behind closed doors, there was no punchline, only pressure. Nick's childhood was, by all accounts, comfortable, but distant, luxury without warmth, expectations without guidance, love conditional. Rob wasn't unkind, but he wasn't there. At least, not in the ways Nick needed him to be. By the time Nick was 8, Rob was already being spoken of in reverent tones by Variety, the New York Times, and every film school professor across the country. His catalog of hits kept growing. A Few Good Men, The American President, The Bucket List. He was a king in his castle. But Nick was the court jester no one watched. Too sensitive, too quiet, too withdrawn. While his father jetted off to premieres and gave press interviews about the power of storytelling, Nick was left with nannies, tutors, and an ever-growing library of films that starred other people's children. The early signs were there. By 11, Nick had started journaling obsessively, scribbling not just ideas, but questions. Why does Dad never laugh at my jokes? Why do they all pretend? Why do I feel like something's fake? At first, the entries seemed like those of any introspective kid, but then they darkened. His movies are lies. He took what wasn't his. I know about the beach house. That last line, chilling. Especially when you realize no one had ever told Nick about Malibu. At least, not directly. So how did he find out? That part remains murky. Some say it was Deborah Kane, whom Nick met once, briefly, at a party in the early 2000s. She reportedly mentioned that weekend your dad and Mel had where they cracked the idea. Others claim it was from the journals of Michelle Reiner, Rob's wife, who reportedly kept meticulous notes, scripts, and letters, some of which disappeared after her death. But the most plausible source? Nick read The Hollow Man. He found a draft. Somewhere. Somehow. And when he did, something inside him snapped into place. It explained the weirdness, the evasiveness, the stories that didn't line up, the reverence that never felt earned. And it explained why, no matter how many times he tried to connect with his father, there was always a wall. Because Rob Reiner wasn't just a distant dad. He was living someone else's truth. And Nick couldn't unsee it. He brought it up once, tentatively. A dinner in 2010. Father and son, barely making eye contact. Nick, freshly out of rehab for the first time. Dad, I read something. About an old script. You and Mel. Rob reportedly froze. Then chuckled. Then said, "Kiddo, you really think that old man invented the genre? Come on." It wasn't just denial. It was mockery. And Nick never brought it up again. Not with Rob. But his journals kept growing, stacking, pages filled with rage, confusion, obsession. He started calling Spinal Tap the beginning of the lie. He referred to Rob not as Dad, but as the thief. And Mel? He called him the ghost, the one who screamed without sound. This wasn't just a son questioning his father. This was a man unraveling inside a house of mirrors. By the time Nick was in his 20s, he was in and out of psychiatric treatment. Diagnosed with bipolar disorder, struggled with substance abuse, attempted screenwriting, failed. He lived in the guest house of the Reiner estate. His parents footed the bill, but the connection was brittle. Michelle tried to keep peace. She visited him regularly, brought groceries, watched movies with him on the weekends. Rob, not so much. He was older now, slower. He'd softened in public, but hardened in private. Nick described him, in one haunting entry as a man surrounded by mirrors. But when you look close, none of the reflections match. So when the murders happened, the world gasped. But those closest to the family, they weren't shocked. They were devastated, but not surprised, because Nick had been sounding the alarm for years. He told therapists. He told friends. He even told Romy. And Romy, to her eternal guilt, dismissed it. "Don't take Dad so seriously," she told him once. "You're projecting." But Nick wasn't projecting. He was detonating. And no one saw the timer. Let's look at the night of the murders. January 3rd, 2026. Earlier that afternoon, Nick had argued with Rob, loudly. The neighbors heard. Police were not called, but Michelle later confided to a friend that something felt different this time. Nick had reportedly confronted his father again about the Hollow Man, demanded acknowledgement, wanted a taped confession. Rob laughed. Not cruelly, just dismissively. The way you wave away a mosquito. That night, Michelle was cooking dinner when the attack happened. Police reports indicate she was killed first, likely trying to intervene. Rob was next. Both suffered multiple stab wounds. Nick didn't flee. He didn't hide. He sat in the guest house, blood on his clothes, scribbling in the final pages of his journal. When police arrived, he looked up, calm. He said, "I ended the lie." Let that sink in. Not, "I'm sorry." Not, "It was a mistake." Not, "I snapped." But, "I ended the lie." To Nick, this wasn't just murder. It was justice. A brutal, tragic attempt to balance scales that had been tipped long before he was born. But was it really about the script? Or was it about something deeper? Because the Hollow Man wasn't just a missing credit. It was a metaphor. A symbol of a man Nick could never touch. A father whose success felt like a mask. Whose love came with strings. Whose legacy smothered everything around it. And in the end, Nick did what broken men often do. He destroyed what he couldn't repair. The aftermath was chaos. The press labeled him a deranged heir. Psychologists debated his diagnosis. Conspiracy theorists claimed the murder was staged. But the journal told the real story. In the final entry, dated January 3rd, 2026, Nick wrote, "He stole the voice of a giant and passed it off as his whisper." The world clapped. I couldn't stop the lie, but I could end the echo. Chilling, poetic, disturbed, and undeniably intentional. Which leaves us with a haunting question. If Rob had ever admitted the truth, just once, would any of this have happened? Would Mel have spoken sooner? Would Deborah have resurfaced? Would Nick have healed? Or was the silence always doomed to collapse into something louder and bloodier? As the trial looms and Nick faces 2 counts of first-degree murder, the world is watching. But there's one more voice still waiting in the wings. The one person who saw it all, who watched the brainstorm, typed the notes, heard the laughter, the final collaborator, the one Nick named on the last page of his journal. R.S. She knew. And now, she's ready to talk. What happens when a perfect family portrait starts to crack, and no one wants to admit they see it? From the outside, the Reiner household was the definition of Hollywood stability. A multi-million-dollar Brentwood estate, lush gardens, charity galas, photos with presidents. The kind of family people pointed to and said, "That's how you do it in showbiz." But behind those gated walls, the portrait was peeling. Slowly, painfully, and over years. And if you looked close enough, the cracks were never just on the surface. They were everywhere. Let's start with the matriarch, Michelle Singer Reiner, Rob's wife of over 30 years. A producer, a philanthropist, a woman always captured with a calm smile beside her husband. She was the glue, the buffer, the one who smoothed tensions with grace, keeping the family functioning like a well-oiled publicity machine. But even Michelle couldn't fix what she wouldn't name. Because while she held charity balls and made powerful speeches about global justice, something in her own home was unraveling. That something was Nick. At first, it looked like teenage angst. Then it became substance abuse. Then it became a storm of unpredictable moods, rehab relapses, and a growing obsession with one topic, the legacy of his father. Michelle tried to intervene, again and again. She was the one who arranged therapy. She was the one who pushed Rob to attend family sessions. She was the one who refused to kick Nick out when things got dark in the guest house. She was also the one who, according to close family friends, started keeping a journal of her own. A daily log. Thoughts. Concerns. Warnings. That journal, found in her bedroom drawer after the murders, contained entries that would send chills through even seasoned homicide detectives. Here's just one, dated October 12, 2025. Nick's eyes are different now. He doesn't yell anymore. He stares. He asked again about the beach house weekend. I told him it wasn't his business. He said, "That lie is my whole life." I don't know what he means, but I'm scared. And another, just weeks before her death. He's slipping. Rob refuses to talk to him unless it's through me. Romy won't come by if she knows he's here. Something is wrong. I feel it in my skin. But Michelle wasn't the only one sensing danger. Neighbors had begun noticing unusual activity. One, speaking anonymously to the Los Angeles Times, reported, "I heard shouting, sometimes screaming, from the guest house at night. Once I saw Nick pacing the yard at 3 a.m., shirtless, mumbling." Another said, "We used to get invited to Reiner parties. Not anymore. It was like they were trying to pretend nothing was wrong. But you could feel it. And yet, through it all, Rob kept up appearances. He was still attending award shows, still doing interviews, still writing op-eds about political integrity. But privately, he was retreating. According to his longtime publicist, Rob had grown increasingly reclusive in his final 2 years. He stopped answering calls from old friends. He refused to watch new films. He started walking with a cane he insisted he didn't need. And most telling of all, he stopped talking about his past work. No mentions of Spinal Tap. No nods to his early career. Just silence. Some thought it was humility. Others, guilt. Because what if, deep down, Rob knew the legacy was cracking? That the illusion he'd built on charisma and borrowed brilliance was collapsing? That his son was the only one brave, or broken, enough to name the truth? That fear became a phantom in the house. You see, Nick wasn't just angry. He was watching. He kept records, notes, old interviews. He once printed out every review of Spinal Tap ever published and highlighted the phrases that echoed the Hollow Man's draft. He posted sticky notes across his guest house wall. Stolen voice. Dad never credited Mel. Erased to replace. Truth will bleed. And then there was the strange package. Weeks before the murders, a mysterious envelope was delivered to Deborah Kane's home in Tucson. No return address. Inside, a photo. A grainy, black and white snapshot of Mel Brooks and Rob Reiner, sitting together at that Malibu beach house, laughing over a stack of papers. On the back, scribbled in red ink. They built it together. One man took the credit. Now the truth comes home. No name. But investigators traced the postmark. Los Angeles. The same zip code as the Reiner estate. Was it Nick? Almost certainly. Was it a threat? No. It was a warning. The final act was already underway. Now let's talk about Romy. The youngest. The artist. The daughter who tried to escape the shadow by embracing the family name, not fighting it. She adored her father. Respected her mother. But Nick? Nick scared her. She'd told friends in private that his eyes were haunted. That he spoke in riddles. That he once asked her, "If everything you ever were was built on a lie, would you still love me if I tore it down?" She didn't know how to answer. And that's what she told police, too. Because it was Romy who found the bodies. It was Romy who made the 911 call. And it was Romy who first said, on record, "My brother should be a suspect. Not out of spite. Not out of revenge. Out of heartbreak. Because the family was no longer a family. It was a pressure cooker. A war zone disguised as a mansion. A beautiful home filled with ghosts. And everyone in that house knew it. They just didn't know how it would end. Until it did. The night of the murders, police found no signs of forced entry, no robbery, no struggle beyond the direct violence. Michelle was found in the kitchen, Rob in the hallway, Nick in the guest house, calm, as if nothing had happened. Except everything had. The crime scene told one story, but the family journals told another. A slow, inevitable disintegration. Because the Reiners weren't just killed by knives. They were killed by silence, denial, secrets too long unspoken. They were a family under siege, not from outsiders, but from the truth they refused to face. And now, that truth is spilling into the world. And at the center of it, one final piece. One more witness. One name scribbled again and again in Nick's final pages. RS knew it all. RS. Not a sibling. Not a cousin. A forgotten collaborator. A woman who vanished after Malibu, only to resurface in Rob's personal emails years later, begging him to tell the truth. Now, she's ready to go on record. And what she has to say might just destroy what's left of Rob Reiner's legacy. What do you see when you walk into a crime scene? Blood? Evidence? Or the echoes of everything that could have stopped it? For veteran LAPD Detective Marcus Tolan, the call came at 9:42 p.m., a double homicide in Brentwood. The address? Familiar. Very familiar. 13 Crestview Terrace. The Reiner estate. Tolan had seen celebrity cases before. Overdoses. Stalkers. Meltdowns turned deadly. But this? This was different. From the second he stepped out of his cruiser, something felt wrong. Not just tragic, but personal. The Reiners weren't just Hollywood royalty. They were safe royalty. The kind everyone liked. The kind who stood for social justice, political activism, decency. Rob Reiner, the man who gave us laughter and courtrooms and fairy tales. Now dead. And not just dead, but murdered. Alongside his wife of 34 years. Inside the gates of their $13.5 million fortress. A crime had unfolded that would tear through the fabric of Hollywood like a rip in velvet. Let's walk through it, step by step. Because it wasn't the gore that haunted the investigators. It was the intimacy. Michelle was found in the kitchen, slumped beside the center island. A pot of chicken soup still simmering on the stove. Her body showed multiple stab wounds, front and back. Defensive cuts on her forearms. She had fought. Rob was found in the hallway just outside his study. One shoe off. Reading glasses shattered on the hardwood floor. He had been stabbed 8 times, deep, deliberate strikes. The coroner later confirmed both victims died within minutes of each other. No signs of forced entry. No sign of struggle beyond the immediate violence. No ransacking. No valuables missing. This wasn't a burglary gone wrong. This was targeted, personal. And then came the third scene. The guest house. Just steps away from the main house. Once a poolside retreat. Now Nick Reiner's private world. Police entered expecting chaos. Instead, they found calm. Nick sat on a couch, barefoot, wearing the same clothes he'd worn that morning. Blood on his shirt, on his hands, a journal on his lap. He looked up when they entered. Didn't flinch. Didn't run. He said one thing. They didn't listen. I had to finish the story. That sentence would become infamous. Quoted, parroted, debated, dismantled. But in that moment, it told the officers exactly what they needed to know. Nick wasn't denying it. He wasn't confused. He was resigned. They read him his rights. He didn't resist. But what came next made the hair on Detective Tolan's neck rise. They searched the guest house. Notebooks. Dozens of them. Shelves of them. All color-coded. Labeled with cryptic titles. Echoes. Voice. Original Sin. The Ghost in the Cut. Each one filled with obsessive scribblings about legacy, betrayal, authorship. Mel Brooks' name appeared in nearly every one. So did Rob's. And then, tucked inside a drawer under the bed, they found the Hollow Man. The original printout. Pages marked with annotations. Some in pencil,